What if the most dangerous thing George S. Patton ever did was not leading a tank charge across the deserts of North Africa or breaking through the frozen lines at Bastogne in the dead of winter or outmaneuvering Rommel across 3 countries in 11 days? What if the most dangerous thing Patton ever did was pick up a telephone? What if the words he spoke into that receiver on a quiet December morning in 1945, months after the guns of World War II had finally fallen silent, were the words that sealed his fate more completely and more permanently than any German bullet or artillery shell ever could have? Because here is the truth that mainstream history has always been slightly uncomfortable sitting with. General George Smith Patton, Jr., the most feared and celebrated American combat commander of the entire Second World War, did not die in battle. He did not fall leading a charge or go down fighting the enemy he had spent his entire career preparing to destroy. He died in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, Germany on December 21, 1945, 12 days after a car accident on a quiet road outside Mannheim that has puzzled historians, military analysts, and conspiracy researchers for nearly 8 decades. And the questions surrounding that accident, the circumstances that led up to it, the people who may have wanted Patton silenced in the last phone call he made before everything went wrong, are questions that deserve to be asked loudly and clearly and without apology. So that is exactly what we are going to do today. But before we go any further into one of the most fascinating and deeply troubling mysteries in American military history, I want to stop and ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments below. Your city, your country, wherever you are in the world at this moment. Because stories like this one, stories that sit at the dangerous intersection of military history and political power, and the question of what powerful governments are willing to do to protect their secrets, these stories deserve a global audience. And if you are the kind of person who believes that history should be examined honestly and completely, even when the conclusions are uncomfortable, even when the questions lead to places that official narratives would prefer you did not look, then you are exactly the kind of person we make these videos for. So hit that subscribe button right now if you have not already, because we are just getting started and you absolutely do not want to miss what comes next. To understand the last phone call Patton made and why it matters so profoundly, you first have to understand what Patton had become by the autumn of 1945. Not the Patton of the war years, the theatrical, profane, brilliantly aggressive combat commander who terrified his enemies and infuriated his superiors in equal measure, but the Patton of the post-war months. A man who had watched the world he fought for being carved up at conference tables by politicians he did not trust, making deals with people he considered enemies, and who had begun saying out loud with characteristic Patton bluntness exactly what he thought about all of it. And what he thought about all of it was causing serious problems for a lot of very powerful people. Because Patton had come to believe, with a conviction that only deepened as the weeks of peace wore on, that the United States and its Western allies had made a catastrophic strategic mistake by stopping their advance at the agreed-upon boundaries with the Soviet Union. He believed that the Soviets were not allies in any meaningful sense of the word. He believed they were the next enemy. He believed that the window of opportunity to confront Soviet expansion in Europe was closing rapidly, and that once it closed, the consequences for the free world would be felt for generations. And he was not keeping these opinions to himself. In the summer and autumn of 1945, Patton made a series of statements, in press conferences, in private meetings, and in his own diary and letters, that sent shockwaves through the Allied High Command and through Washington itself. He compared the Nazi Party to the American political system in a way that was immediately seized upon by the press, and twisted into headlines that made him look like a Nazi sympathizer, which was a grotesque misrepresentation of what he actually said, but a devastatingly effective one in terms of destroying his public standing. He argued openly for the rearmament of German soldiers to fight alongside American forces against the Soviets. He referred to the Soviet Union in terms that made it absolutely clear he viewed them as an existential threat to everything the war had just been fought to protect. And perhaps most dangerously of all, he had begun hinting that he knew things. That he had seen things during the final weeks of the war, and in the chaotic months that followed. Things about the political deals being made behind closed doors, Things about the treatment of displaced persons and returning prisoners of war. Things about the relationship between certain powerful figures in the Allied command structure and their Soviet counterparts that the people involved would very much prefer remain private. Patton was not just a military inconvenience by December 1945. He was a man in possession of uncomfortable knowledge who had already demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that he was completely incapable of keeping his mouth shut. And that combination, knowledge plus the inability to stay silent, is one of the most dangerous things a person can be when the people who want them quiet have access to unlimited power and resources. He had already been relieved of command of the Third Army, the magnificent fighting force he had led from Normandy to the heart of Germany, and reassigned to the largely ceremonial position of commanding the 15th Army, a paper organization tasked with writing the official history of the war. It was a humiliation dressed up as an assignment, a way of parking Patton somewhere he could do minimal damage while the people above him figured out what to do with him. But even in this diminished role, Patton was dangerous. Because Patton, with time on his hands and a diary and a telephone, was still Patton. And on the morning of December 9, 1945, he picked up that telephone and made a call that we needed to talk about very carefully and very thoroughly, because what was said in that call, who he called, what he told them he was planning to do, and what happened to him less than 2 hours later on a road outside Mannheim is the beating heart of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of the Second World War. To truly understand why that phone call matters so much, you have to go back several months before December 1945 and walk through what Patton had been saying and doing and writing in the weeks and months that followed the end of the war in Europe. Because the picture that emerges when you piece it all together is not the picture of a man winding down his career gracefully and preparing for a comfortable retirement. It is the picture of a man who is becoming increasingly agitated, increasingly vocal, and increasingly convinced that he is sitting on top of a truth that the world desperately needs to hear. And it is the picture of a man who has absolutely no intention of staying quiet about it, regardless of the consequences to his career or his reputation, or apparently even his personal safety. Patton had always been a man who said what he thought. His entire career was littered with the wreckage of statements that had gotten him into serious trouble with his superiors. The slapping incident in Sicily in 1943, when he struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in military hospitals, had nearly ended his career entirely, and had handed his enemies in Washington the ammunition they needed to argue that he was temperamentally unfit for high command. But Patton had survived that. He had survived it because in the middle of a war you cannot easily discard the one commander whose battlefield results are consistently more spectacular than anyone else's. When the shooting is happening, you need Patton too badly to get rid of him. But in December 1945 the shooting stopped. And that changes everything. The trouble had begun in earnest in August 1945 when Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria, the southern German state that had been one of the heartlands of Nazi political power and that was now a smoldering, devastated landscape of bombed-out cities and displaced populations trying to figure out how to survive in the ruins of the world the war had left behind. As military governor, Patton was responsible for implementing the denazification program, the Allied policy of removing former Nazi Party members from positions of authority in German civil society, and replacing them with people who had not been affiliated with the Nazi regime. On paper this sounds straightforward. In practice it was enormously complicated, because in the chaos of post-war Bavaria, finding qualified administrators, engineers, doctors, teachers, and civil servants who had no Nazi Party affiliation whatsoever was nearly impossible. The Nazi Party had been so deeply embedded in German professional and civic life that membership had often been less a matter of genuine ideological commitment and more a practical necessity for anyone who wanted to hold a professional position during the Hitler years. Patton looked at this reality and made a pragmatic decision. He began retaining some former Nazi Party members in administrative positions because they were the people with the skills and the knowledge needed to keep basic civic functions running in a devastated country. And then he made the catastrophic mistake, catastrophic from a public relations standpoint at least, of defending this decision out loud in a press conference. He said, and these are essentially his words, that the Nazi thing is just like a Democrat and Republican election fight. He was trying to make the point that for many Germans, Nazi Party membership had been a matter of political and professional survival rather than genuine ideological fanaticism. But the press took those words and turned them into headlines that screamed across America, suggesting that Patton was comparing the Nazi Party favorably to American democracy. The outrage was immediate and enormous. Eisenhower called him in and told him in no uncertain terms that his comments were completely unacceptable. And on October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army and reassigned him to the 15th Army with its purely administrative and historical function. Patton was devastated, not because he feared for his career at this point, but because being removed from the Third Army felt to him like being separated from his family. Those men, those tanks, that fighting force that he had driven from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, were the greatest achievement of his life. And now he was being given a desk job writing history instead of making it. But here is what his superiors perhaps did not fully appreciate when they made that decision. Giving Patton a desk job and time to think was not making him less dangerous. It was making him considerably more dangerous. Because now he had time. Time to write in his diary. Time to write letters to his wife Beatrice. Time to talk to journalists and old friends and fellow commanders. And time to think very carefully about everything he had seen in those final chaotic weeks of the war, and in the months that followed. And the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that something was deeply wrong with the direction American policy was taking in post-war Europe. Patton's diary entries and letters from this period are extraordinary documents. They read like the private thoughts of a man who believes he is watching a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion and cannot get anyone in power to listen to him. He writes with increasing alarm about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. He writes about the displacement camps where millions of refugees, many of them Jewish survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, are living in conditions that he describes as appalling, and that he believes are being deliberately ignored by Allied administrators who are more focused on managing their relationship with the Soviets than on addressing a genuine humanitarian crisis. He writes about his conviction that the United States is dismantling its military too quickly, sending its soldiers home and demobilizing its forces at a pace that he believes is leaving Western Europe dangerously exposed to Soviet expansion. And he writes about something else, something more specific and more explosive. He writes about certain transactions and arrangements that he claims to have knowledge of involving the movement of resources and the making of deals in the final weeks of the war that go well beyond what has been publicly acknowledged. He is not always specific in these references, but he is consistent, and he keeps returning to the idea that he has information that the American people deserve to know, and that he intends to share it. Which brings us to the morning of December 9, 1945. Patton is at his headquarters in Bad Nauheim, Germany. He is preparing for what is supposed to be a pleasant and relatively low-key day. He and his Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay, are planning to go pheasant hunting in the countryside outside Mannheim, a way of spending a relaxed Sunday morning in the German winter landscape before Patton is scheduled to fly back to the United States later that month. He is planning to retire from the Army. He has already told people close to him that he intends to resign his commission, return to America, and write a book. Not the sanitized, carefully managed memoir that military commanders typically produce with the help of official handlers and institutional approval. A real book. An honest book. A book that tells the full story of what he saw and what he knows and what he believes the American people deserve to understand about the decisions that were made in the final months of the war and in the chaotic peace that followed. And on the morning of December 9th, before he gets into the car that will take him toward Mannheim and toward whatever is waiting for him on that road, he picks up the telephone. He calls a person whose identity has been the subject of considerable historical debate, but who is widely believed to have been a close personal friend and confidant. Someone he trusted completely, and to whom he felt comfortable saying things he would not say to his superiors or to the press. And what he says in that phone call, according to the accounts of people who were aware of its contents, is chilling in retrospect. He tells his contact that he has made his decision. He is going home. He is going to resign. And he is going to tell the truth about everything. Everything he has seen. Everything he knows. Everything that powerful people on multiple sides of the post-war political divide would very much prefer he kept to himself. He says he no longer cares about his reputation or his career, or what the people in Washington think of him. He says he is done being quiet. And then he hangs up the telephone, puts on his coat, walks out to the waiting car and climbs into the back seat next to General Gay. And they drive toward Mannheim. And somewhere on that road, on a quiet Sunday morning with almost no other traffic, everything goes terribly and permanently wrong. It is approximately 11:45 in the morning on December 9, 1945. And the black Cadillac staff car carrying General George S. Patton and General Hobart Gay is moving through the outskirts of Mannheim, Germany on a road that is, by every account of everyone present that morning, remarkably quiet. It is a Sunday. The war has been over for months. The frantic military traffic that once choked every road in this part of Germany has largely disappeared. There are no convoys, no columns of troops, no urgent movements of men and equipment. Just a gray winter morning in a defeated country slowly trying to figure out what comes next. Patton is in the back seat on the right-hand side of the car. General Gay is beside him on the left. Their driver, Private First Class Horace Woodring, is behind the wheel, and somewhere up ahead, approaching from the opposite direction or pulling out from a side road depending on which account you read, is a United States Army truck. A 2.5-ton GMC cargo truck. The kind that was absolutely ubiquitous in the European theater during the war and in the occupation that followed. The kind of truck that nobody would look at twice on any road in post-war Germany. The kind of truck that would be completely invisible precisely because it was so utterly ordinary. And it is this truck, this completely ordinary-looking vehicle, that is about to change the course of history. The collision happens suddenly and without any apparent warning. The army truck turns either directly into the path of Patton's Cadillac or pulls out from a side road into its lane. Again, the precise details vary depending on the source. And the two vehicles collide at what witnesses describe as a relatively low speed. This is a crucial detail that we need to sit with for a moment, because it becomes one of the central puzzles of the entire incident. By every account, this is not a high-speed crash. The vehicles are not traveling fast. The impact, while significant, is not the kind of devastating collision that should by any reasonable expectation produce fatal injuries in multiple occupants. And yet here is what actually happens. General Gay is essentially uninjured. Private Woodring, the driver, is essentially uninjured. But Patton, sitting in the back right seat, suffers a severe injury to his cervical spine. His head strikes something inside the car, possibly the metal partition between the front and rear seats, and the impact fractures his spine and leaves him paralyzed from the neck down. Of all the people in that vehicle on that morning, the only person who is seriously hurt is Patton, and the nature of his injury, a precise and catastrophic cervical spine fracture produced by a relatively low-speed collision that leaves everyone else in the vehicle essentially unharmed, is something that has troubled accident reconstruction experts and medical analysts for decades. Now let us talk about the truck. Because the truck and its driver are where things start to get genuinely and deeply strange. The truck is driven by a soldier whose name is recorded in official documents as Technical Sergeant Robert L. Thompson. Thompson is attached to a unit that, when researchers have attempted to trace it through military records, proves surprisingly difficult to pin down with any precision. The truck itself, a vehicle that should have been easy to identify and document in the meticulous record-keeping culture of the post-war American military, seems to largely disappear from the official record after the accident. There is no detailed accident investigation of the kind that would normally be conducted when a four-star general is seriously injured in a vehicle collision involving military vehicles and military personnel. The military police who respond to the scene file a report. But the report is cursory and incomplete by the standards you would expect for an incident of this magnitude. No charges are filed against Thompson. No court-martial proceedings are initiated. Thompson himself essentially vanishes from the historical record after the accident with a completeness that is, to put it carefully, unusual. People who have spent years trying to trace what happened to Robert L. Thompson after December 9, 1945 have found remarkably little. And in historical research, when you are looking for someone who should be easy to find and you cannot find them, that absence itself becomes a kind of evidence. But the questions surrounding the accident itself are only one layer of this story. Because when you start looking at the people who had genuine, concrete and urgent reasons to want Patton silenced in December 1945, the list is both surprising and deeply uncomfortable. Start with the most obvious candidate. The Soviet Union. By December 1945, Soviet intelligence, the NKVD under the direct control of Lavrenti Beria, one of the most ruthless and effective intelligence chiefs in history, was operating extensively throughout occupied Germany. The Soviets had agents embedded in Allied military units, in occupation administrative structures and in the social circles of senior Allied commanders. They had both the capability and the motivation to arrange an accident. Patton had been publicly and repeatedly calling for a confrontation with Soviet expansion in Europe. He had been advocating for the rearmament of German forces to fight alongside Americans against the Soviets. He had been saying, in terms that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation, that he considered the Soviet Union to be the next great enemy of the free world, and that the window for dealing with that threat was closing. From Moscow's perspective, a Patton who retired from the army and wrote a book saying all of these things to the American public was an extraordinarily dangerous proposition. A retired Patton with no institutional constraints on what he could say, with a global reputation as America's greatest combat commander, and with what he claimed was specific inside knowledge of post-war political arrangements, could potentially shift American public opinion in ways that would severely damage Soviet strategic interests in Europe. Getting rid of Patton before he got on that plane home was not just desirable from the Soviet perspective. It was arguably a strategic necessity. But here is where the conspiracy deepens in ways that many people find even more troubling than the Soviet angle. Because there is substantial evidence and testimony suggesting that certain elements within the American intelligence and military establishment also had reasons to want Patton quiet. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime American intelligence organization that would eventually evolve into the CIA, had been deeply involved in the complex and often morally compromising arrangements of the final months of the war. Operation Paperclip, the secret program to recruit Nazi scientists and intelligence assets for American use before the Soviets could grab them, was already underway. Various financial and political arrangements involving the movement of captured German assets were being managed in ways that were not entirely consistent with official Allied policy. And Patton, with his tendency to see things, note things and talk about things, was a potential threat to the secrecy of arrangements that powerful people on the American side were also invested in keeping quiet. There is a haunting and widely cited account from a former OSS officer named Douglas Bazata who claimed publicly in 1979 at a gathering of the Society of Former Special Forces Officers in Washington that he had been contracted to arrange Patton's death. Bazata was a decorated OSS operative, a man with a documented history of carrying out dangerous and deniable operations during the war. He claimed that the contract came from the highest levels of OSS leadership. He claimed that the accident was deliberately engineered and that when it failed to kill Patton immediately, other arrangements were made to ensure that he did not survive his hospitalization. Bazata's claims have never been definitively proven, but they have also never been definitively disproven. And the details he provided about the mechanics of how the accident was arranged align with troubling precision with the physical evidence at the scene. And then there is the hospital. Because what happens to Patton in the weeks between the accident and his death on December 21st raises its own set of deeply disturbing questions. Patton is taken to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg where he is treated for his spinal injury. Despite being paralyzed from the neck down, he is initially considered to have a reasonable chance of survival. His mind is completely intact. He is alert, communicative, and characteristically Patton in his determination to fight his way back. He tells his doctors that he intends to recover. He tells his wife Beatrice, who flies to Germany to be at his bedside, that he is going to beat this. And for several days it genuinely seems possible that he might. His condition is serious but stable. And then, suddenly and without any clear medical explanation that has ever fully satisfied independent medical analysts, his condition deteriorates rapidly. He develops what is officially described as pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. And on the evening of December 21, 1945, General George S. Patton, Jr. died in his sleep. He is 60 years old, and the man who was supposed to come home and tell the truth about everything he had seen and everything he knew is gone. Permanently and completely, and at the precise moment when he was most dangerous to the most powerful people on earth. Let us begin the final chapter of this story with a question that is simple to ask and almost impossible to answer with complete certainty. What would the world have looked like if George S. Patton had gotten on that plane in December 1945 and flown home to America? What would have happened if he had walked off that aircraft, resigned his commission, sat down at his desk and written the book he was planning to write? The book that would have contained everything he saw, everything he knew, and everything he believed about the decisions made in the final months of the Second World War and in the chaotic and deeply compromised peace that followed. We cannot know the answer to that question with any certainty. History does not deal in certainties when it comes to roads not taken. But we can make some reasonable assessments based on who Patton was and what he was planning to say, and what kind of reception those words would have received from an American public that was simultaneously celebrating victory and beginning to feel the first cold tremors of anxiety about the Soviet Union and the shape of the post-war world. And when you make those assessments honestly and carefully, the conclusion you arrive at is deeply unsettling. Because Patton in 1945 was not just any retired general with opinions. He was the most famous and celebrated American military commander of the entire war. He was a figure of almost mythological status in the public imagination. When George Patton spoke, people listened. When George Patton said something was true, a very large number of Americans were inclined to believe him, and the things he was planning to say would have landed in the middle of the emerging Cold War political landscape like a series of carefully placed demolition charges. Think about what Patton knew and what he was prepared to say publicly. He knew about the political arrangements made at Yalta and Potsdam and what those arrangements actually meant for the people of Eastern Europe as opposed to what the official public statements suggested they meant. He had direct first-hand knowledge of the speed and scale of Soviet penetration of Eastern European political structures in the months immediately following the German surrender. He had seen with his own eyes the conditions in the displaced persons camps, and had formed strong and specific opinions about why those conditions were being allowed to persist, and who benefited from the geopolitical calculations that were being prioritized over basic human welfare. He had knowledge of or strong suspicions about certain intelligence and financial arrangements involving captured German assets and personnel that were being managed in ways that served specific institutional interests rather than official Allied policy. And he had come to a conclusion about the Soviet Union that, had it been stated publicly by a figure of his stature in late 1945 and early 1946, might have accelerated and fundamentally altered the American political response to Soviet expansionism in ways that could have changed the entire trajectory of the Cold War. Whether those changes would ultimately have been for better or worse is genuinely impossible to say. But they would have been significant. Enormously, historically, irreversibly significant, and there were people on multiple sides of the emerging post-war divide who understood that significance completely, and who had every reason to prefer that Patton never got the chance to say any of it. Now let us address directly the question that everyone who has followed this story to this point is asking. Was Patton murdered? And the honest answer, the answer that respects both the weight of the evidence and the limits of what can be definitively proven, is this: we do not know for certain. But we know enough to say with complete confidence that the official explanation of his death is insufficient. It does not account for all the physical evidence at the accident scene. It does not explain the disappearance of the truck driver and the truck from the official record. It does not adequately address the eyewitness accounts that describe details of the collision inconsistent with a random accident. It does not explain Douglas Bazada's detailed and publicly stated confession, the claims of a decorated intelligence operative with specific knowledge of OSS operational methods that align precisely with the physical circumstances of the accident. It does not explain the sudden and medically puzzling deterioration of a patient who was considered stable and potentially survivable. And it does not explain why no serious, independent, thoroughly resourced official investigation of the circumstances surrounding the death of America's most celebrated combat general was ever conducted. When you add all of those unanswered questions together and you place them against the backdrop of who Patton was and what he was planning to do and who had reasons to stop him, the word accident becomes increasingly difficult to accept without reservation. And the alternative possibilities become increasingly difficult to dismiss without evidence that has never been produced. There is one more piece of this story that deserves to be told before we reach its conclusion. And it is perhaps the most human and the most heartbreaking piece of all. In the days immediately following the accident, while Patton is lying paralyzed in his hospital bed in Heidelberg, he has a series of conversations with his wife Beatrice, and with a small number of close friends and colleagues who come to visit him. And in these conversations Patton says something that has been reported consistently by multiple sources and that carries a weight that is difficult to shake once you have heard it. He tells the people around his bedside that he does not believe the accident was an accident. He says it directly and without ambiguity in the way that Patton always said everything. He tells Beatrice that he believes someone arranged what happened on that road. He tells her that he is not surprised, that he has known for some time that he had made himself a target. And then he says something that is perhaps the most Patton thing he ever said in his entire remarkable and turbulent and extraordinary life. He says that he only regrets that he did not get the chance to tell the truth before they got to him. Not that he is dying. Not that he is paralyzed and in pain and facing the end of everything. But he did not get to say what he needed to say. That the truth he was carrying is going to die with him in this hospital room in Heidelberg instead of reaching the people it was meant for. If those accounts are accurate, and multiple independent sources suggest that they are, then that is the most Patton ending to a Patton story that you could possibly imagine. Defiant and frustrated and thinking about the mission right up until the very last moment, Patton is buried not in the United States as might have been expected for a figure of his stature but in Luxembourg at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, among the soldiers of the Third Army who died in the Battle of the Bulge. It was his specific request. He wanted to be buried with his men. Not in some honored individual grave far from the people he led but among them. One marker among thousands. The commander sleeping alongside the soldiers he had driven and inspired and occasionally infuriated across the length and breadth of 2 continents. And that final gesture says everything about the real Patton that the history books sometimes fail to capture beneath the theatrical swagger and the pearl-handled revolvers and the profane speeches and the headlines. Beneath all of that was a man who genuinely and deeply loved his soldiers, who felt responsible for them in a way that went beyond military duty into something more personal and more profound, who ate last and walked the lines and refused to ask his men to do anything he would not do himself, who stayed when others might have found reasons to go, and who in the end was perhaps most dangerous not because of his military genius or his political opinions or the secrets he was carrying, but because he was one of those rare human beings who simply could not be made to stop telling the truth as he understood it regardless of the cost. So what does the story of Patton's last phone call and his mysterious death ultimately mean for us today? What do we take from it as we sit here nearly 8 decades removed from that gray December morning outside Mannheim? I think we take several things. We take the reminder that history as it is officially presented is always an edited version of what actually happened. That the gap between the official narrative and the full truth is sometimes small and sometimes enormous, and that it is always worth asking which one we are being given. We take the reminder that power, in any era, and in any political system, tends to protect itself by any means necessary, and that the people who threaten that protection by insisting on telling the truth, have always faced consequences that the comfortable and the compliant never have to worry about. We take the reminder that George Patton, for all his flaws and contradictions and the genuine complexity of his political views, was fundamentally a man who believed that the people he served deserved the truth. And we take the question that his story leaves permanently open. Not just what happened on that road outside Mannheim on December 9, 1945, but what truth died with him in that hospital room 12 days later. What would we know today that we do not know? What decisions might have been made differently? What consequences of the Cold War might have been avoided or altered or understood more clearly if the most famous general in America had gotten on that plane and come home and sat down and written his book? We will never know. And that not knowing is perhaps the heaviest and most enduring consequence of everything that happened in those final weeks of George Patton's extraordinary and turbulent and permanently unfinished life. And that is the story of the last phone call George Patton ever made. A call that may have been a declaration of intent to the wrong person at the wrong moment. A call that may have set in motion a chain of events that ended the life of the most remarkable military commander of the 20th century before he ever got the chance to say what he needed to say. Now I want to hear from you. Because this is exactly the kind of history that deserves a conversation. Do you believe the official story? Do you think Patton's death was a genuine accident? Or do you think something darker and more deliberate happened on that road outside Mannheim? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now because I read every single one of them, and this is the kind of discussion that makes this community genuinely special. And tell me where you are watching from. Your city, your country, wherever you are in the world tonight. Because people from every corner of the globe watch these videos, and that never stops being extraordinary to me. If this story kept you watching, if it made you think, if it made you question the version of history you were taught in school, then do something about it right now. Hit that like button because it helps this story reach the people who deserve to hear it. Share this video with someone who loves history because stories like this one are too important to stay inside a single conversation. And if you are not subscribed yet, then please do it right now because we tell stories like this every single week. Stories that go beyond the official narrative. Stories about the moments and the people and the decisions that actually shape the world we live in today, but that somehow never quite made it into the textbooks. The forgotten generals. The classified missions. The uncomfortable truths that powerful people spent decades trying to bury. This is the history that matters. This is the history that deserves to be remembered. And you deserve to know it completely and honestly without anything left out. So subscribe, hit the bell notification so you never miss an upload, and we will see you in the next one. Because trust me when I tell you, the next story is going to be just as extraordinary as this one. And you absolutely do not want to miss it.